Okay, second news story of the week. And this one was really interesting because typically when a new console comes out, developers are quite tight-lipped about the capabilities of the hardware. And it's especially so when you talk about Nintendo hardware because the concept of performance isn't really core to the proposition of a Nintendo machine. But we had an interview with WCCF Tech this week discussing the Switch 2 with Black Shamrock Studios, a subsidiary of Virtuos. And their technical director, Owen O'Grady, came up with some interesting comments on the Switch 2. And I'm just going to read them out. Why not? GPU-wise, the Switch 2 performs slightly below the Series S. This difference is more noticeable in handheld mode. However, the Series S does not support technologies like DLSS, which the Switch 2 does. This makes the GPU capabilities of the two consoles comparable overall. I think the key word there is comparable. Anyway, CPU-wise, there is a clearer distinction between the two consoles. The Switch 2 is closer to the PS4 in this respect, having a CPU just a bit more powerful than the PS4's. Since most games tend to be more GPU-bound than CPU-bound when well optimized, the impact of this difference largely depends on the specific game and its target frame rate. Any game shipping at 60 FPS on the Series S would easily port to the Switch 2. Likewise, a 30 FPS Series S game that's GPU-bound should also port well. Games with complex physics, animations, or other CPU-intensive elements might incur additional challenges in reaching 30 or 60 FPS or require extra optimization during porting. Oliver, now, this is an interesting one because I do think that word comparable is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. But I think it kind of makes sense if a game is running at 60 FPS on Series S and it doesn't have any sort of key CPU limitations, then it should port well to Switch 2. Mm-hmm. I guess the thing that's slightly confusing me in terms of the language is that there is the sort of implication here. Well, in fact, he says it outright. The Switch 2 performs slightly below the Series S GPU when we've got, basically empirical evidence that suggests that the Series S is actually quite a bit more powerful GPU-wise. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think the claim about the GPU is interesting. I've not done a whole lot of Series S comparisons, but it seems like there's a bit of a mix. There are games like Split Fiction, or Wild Hearts, which we'll talk about in a minute, which in some respects are a big downgrade. And then some games like Street Fighter or maybe Cyberpunk, which are more competitive, in part because they use DLSS, in particular like the higher grade DLSS, where the consoles are using either TAA or they're using FSR2, and they're not really getting a very good result there. So I think it depends a lot on the game. The game that I have looked a lot, though, in terms of a comparison to Series S is Hogwarts Legacy. And that's a game that does look a lot better than Switch 2 on Series S, I would say. Visual settings are a lot better, assets are better, image quality is better. The Switch 2, in that instance, it closely resembles the PlayStation 4 version. It doesn't really come that close to the Series S version, so I don't really know what to say there. It's certainly in that title, it's not delivering a very good experience relative to Series S, and that's a title that clearly has had a lot of time and effort poured into it. It's a very good port, and it's still not quite at that level, which is kind of where I would expect it to be, but certainly doesn't match up with these comments. I do have some questions, though, in particular about systems like Nanite and Lumen and stuff like that. Like, how would that scale? Or a game with really high level of ray tracing complexity, maybe it has very complicated RTGI. How does that scale? I think that's something we don't necessarily have the answer to. In particular, when you look at a system like Nanite and when you look at how limited the performance of a Switch 2 is in portable mode, exactly how well would that actually translate to like a 1.7 teraflop mobile chipset there? Relative to something like a Series S, I don't think it would be too flattering, but we'll have to see in upcoming UE5 titles or games certainly like Star Wars Outlaws. In terms of achieving 30 FPS in Switch 2 when you're achieving 60 FPS in the Series S, on the CPU side of things, I would assume that most games would scale reasonably well, but I would still be concerned about some particularly heavy games on the CPU that we've seen in this generation, like Dragon's Dogma 2, Stalker 2, Space Marine 2, a bunch of sequels in the mix there, I suppose. Those are games that really do suffer on current generation consoles, do have some substantial frame time spikes. I don't think that those titles would translate necessarily so well to Switch 2. So yeah, just a few thoughts there. I think this is an interesting interview, but I'm not necessarily sure I'm 100% on board with the idea that like Switch 2 is a Series S level console in dock mode. I don't think it's quite there necessarily.
It would be a remarkable achievement for, a console that's pulling like 20 watts to be up there with a console that's doing, it's pulling 80. But at the same time, well, what can I say? I'll discuss what I think in a minute. But Alex, curious what you think about this, and certainly on the CPU side, that's kind of a bit more plausible, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you're dealing with, we know it's more plausible because we've seen cross-gen occur, and we've seen all the previous generation titles that were running at 30 or below, slightly below 30, depending on the scenario, being bumped up to 60 with headroom on things like the Series S, Series X, and PlayStation 5, all which have a very similar CPU configuration. So that all seems plausible, how you could essentially get what would be the equivalent of last gen ports. But the thing that was preventing last gen from actually getting a lot of the current gen only ports was GPU feature set and memory, which the Switch has more of, for example. So those would be things that would allow scaling down to actually occur on some level versus being a non-starter, right? It actually supports things like hardware ray tracing. It supports, VRS. It supports a lot of features that are only a part of the DX12U feature set that may be required for some games, or, at least some baseline level of GPU programmability. Well, that's all there in the Switch 2. So it makes sense that it can get current gen ports. Like Oliver, I am a little bit more skeptical about that Series S comparability claim with the dock performance specifically. Just when you look at it realistically, yes, NVIDIA was ahead at a certain time frame regarding power performance, etc., for their chips, but you shouldn't expect, that small wattage envelope of the Switch 2 to be comparable to a much larger wattage envelope that you find in the Series S, in spite of some advantages that it has in machine learning performance, maybe. But even then, I think I would love to napkin math that machine learning performance at some point because it's still a very small chip.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Another thing that I want to say is technically what is being said about the GPU performance being scalable. If you have a 60 or 30 FPS title there, that maybe there'll be some optimization required. That's just a very hand-wavy phrase. But some things do not scale, even if they are running on the GPU. Like there are fixed costs, right? And you would have to start cutting back on visual content at some point. Yes, resolution scales, but the amount of geometry in a level that you can see doesn't necessarily scale. The amount of particles updated per frame wouldn't scale. The top level BV8 structure or whatever won't scale per frame. So you have to essentially cut those things out, make them update less often, or get rid of them altogether, in which case you're not talking about visual parity anymore. And some things, like Oliver was saying, like Nanite and Lumen, their base cost of just existing may be so high that you just can't turn them on in the first place. We've seen that with a couple Series S ports from their Series X or PS5 or PC version, where they just don't run Lumen and the game looks completely different and a lot worse, actually. Or you'll see things like, I think maybe the most recent example is Fortnite on Switch 2, which doesn't seem to be shipping, at least Lumen. I haven't checked to see if Nanite's there, but Lumen not being there, I think, is a pretty big sign, at least right now, where the land is right now, about how scalable that is to Switch 2. Maybe in the future it'll be different, but as arguably the best performing Unreal Engine 5 game on console, and yet they haven't done it yet. So we'll have to see. But
yeah,
a little bit of grains of salt here with what is being said in this interview, I think.
I think there's actually, we need to get our skates on and take a look at Fortnite on Switch 2, because it is a pivotal title for Unreal Engine.
Yeah.
It's the best, pretty much the best version of, the best implementation, rather, of Unreal Engine 5 that you'll see. Because it's made by the people that did Unreal Engine, ultimately. So, yeah, we do need to take a look at that. But then, Oliver, quite rightly, you point out Split Fiction, an Unreal Engine game, which looks nowhere near as good or as smooth as the Series S version. Stuff that I did, obviously this week I posted my Cyberpunk Switch 2 versus Steam Deck video, and, we did have some interesting data there. If we go to those CPU claims, I actually have rendered out here specifically for Oliver to add to the edit, the Beast in Me City Center run which is pretty CPU limited on Switch 2, and we're comparing it against PlayStation 4 and PS4 Pro, and you can see that the Switch 2 is ahead of PlayStation 4, exactly as Owen O'Grady sort of posits. But it's not as smooth as the PlayStation 4 Professional, which had like a 30% boost to the CPU clock, which is quite interesting. I'm going to sort of put a gigantic caveat on these comparisons, though, because as we also pointed out, there is a lot of bespoke optimization for the Switch 2 version of Cyberpunk 2077. Carefully culled geometry, specific settings that may or may not have an impact on CPU. But I also had this particular benchmark sequence rendered out on Series S as well. And I think this one is quite interesting because the actual resolution gap versus Switch 2 is pretty gigantic. You're talking about 720p to 1080p DLSS versus 1296p to 1440p FSR2. But I think what kind of stands out to me is that, it is comparable still, because DLSS is such a really, such a decent upscaler ultimately. The sequence is comparable. I think that's to the credit of the system. And that's exactly kind of what we saw with Switch 1, in that, we saw carefully tailored ports that could be compared to like PS4 games. But ultimately, there's a lot of technical wizardry, optimization, culling that you're not really seeing in the final output that just combines to produce a really good port for a machine that's running on a much lower baseline technological level. I think that's what we're going to be seeing throughout the generation. And there's going to be games that, come out like Cyberpunk. I mean, the other thing, of course, Cyberpunk does have a 60 FPS mode on Series S. It doesn't on Switch 2. There's going to be a lot of games, I suspect, that will be running at 60 on current gen consoles that will be running at 30 or 40 on Switch 2. So that's kind of where the evidence is pointing us at the moment. But I just think generally it's really interesting that a developer is actually talking about system performance, because usually there's a lot of glazing, there's a lot of evasion, because developers don't want to be tied down to specific quotes like this. And I think that and I think that, by saying that if a game runs at 60 FPS on Switch, on Series S rather, it should indeed port easily to Switch 2, because it's kind of like the MO for Switch 1 in a way.
Yeah.
But things get a lot trickier. I mean, it's quite an interesting response overall. Things get a lot trickier though when it's 30 FPS, and you still need 30 FPS on a console hybrid. That's going to be tricky to do there. Any extra thoughts there, Oliver?
Yeah, when I've done Steam Deck testing, it's kind of interesting because you do see that kind of final margin of GPU performance where you're decreasing resolution, you're going down to like 540p, 420p, right, 360p, whatever, internally. And all of a sudden you just run out of GPU margin that you recover. Like the game is just too heavy. Current generation software is just too heavy. So that's one concern, right? Those games would have to be really heavily optimized, maybe rebuilt without lumens, something like this to actually make them work on the device, I think, especially in portable mode. And then on the CPU, with a title like Horizon Forbidden West, Warhammer Space Marine 2, lots of games like this, it's just like at some level you start running into big stutters on kind of a Steam Deck class CPU, and I'd venture that the Steam Deck CPU is probably a bit faster than the CPU in the Switch 2, especially in terms of single-threaded performance, which is an area where Switch 2 is really going to struggle at like a gigahertz there on the Cortex A78 CPU. But maybe there's a different margin of titles where I'd think about games like Dragon Age, The Veilguard, games like that, that maybe are not the most stressful on current generation consoles, that do run at a stable 60 FPS, that are not pushing the current generation consoles in ways that make them an unsatisfying experience, for instance, on a console like the Series S. And those games, I think, probably could scale pretty well to Switch 2, especially if they don't run with like significant ray tracing effects already. So I think that there's probably a number of different buckets you can sort games into, and probably a lot of current generation software would run pretty well on Switch 2 if you put the time and effort into it. But there's probably also a margin of titles where, if you did explore that possibility, I think that maybe major developers would say, I don't think that'll be a good experience in the end.
Yeah, I mean, Oliver, based on what we've seen so far, I think, Switch 2's kind of landed where we thought it would, but has a lot of surprises as well, a lot of pleasant surprises that basically elevate it beyond expectations. I think the power efficiency, for starters, is just stellar. Which was a big concern going into this. It's like, he looked at the handheld specs. It was like, how are they going to run Cyberpunk on a 561 megahertz GPU? And yet, there it is. We had concerns about DLSS computational time based on the hardware available. There is DLSS in a great many games. I mean, I think an interesting example you pointed out there was Street Fighter 6. It is using DLSS, but it is also running at a very low internal resolution, 540p.
Right.
But at the same time, the quality of it is such that it's comparable and in some ways better than the Series S. So there is a lot of comparables going on here, I think.
Yeah, it looks good in those instances, and it's kind of a softer image because you don't necessarily have the throughput to upscale to super high resolutions. But then there's also like this mooted DLSS Lite or lightweight DLSS or whatever you want to call it that produces a much lower quality image in some respects with a lot more issues with like disocclusion and fizzle and nastiness and trails and things like this, but is very cheap to the point where you can do like 4K upscales, things like this, 1080p upscales in handheld mode, producing a good-looking final image that is very sharp. That's been a surprise for me, definitely the presence of that more kind of lightweight-looking DLSS model that actually produces some pretty good image quality in stills and some very sharp imagery, where, that seems less likely for the higher-end model. But yeah, DLSS is a big breakthrough, I would say, and it's a huge advantage over other comparable portables, other PC handhelds, Steam Deck, whatever, that have to cope with FSR. FSR from 360p to 720p does not look very good. DLSS from the same margins actually looks pretty serviceable in games like Kunitsugami and Street Fighter in handheld mode.
Interesting. What do you make of this whole lightweight DLSS thing, Alex? Because going into this, we saw the patent and we were kind of umming and ahhing about it. And we were wondering why it would be developed. But I think it's fair to say that there are quality compromises. Do you think it would have any kind of role to play in PC?
At this point in time, I think the baseline performance for PC GPUs, ever since the RTX, you look at, I covered recently RTX 2060 performance in Doom of the Dark Ages, and I was pleasantly surprised that it could do anything in that title. Large part of that was DLSS using the transformer model, which is more expensive. And I still thought it was reasonable. The amount of what it was costing on the GPU was essentially requiring the game from going down to 720p internal resolution to 540p internal resolution to get a similar performance metric, with DLSS bringing up to 1080p. And that is one of the lowest end RTX branded GPUs that was released on desktop PC space. Obviously, you go to mobile or strange vendor cards, there could be lower stuff, but I don't think that's the remit that typical NVIDIA covers, let alone in their patch notes for their drivers. So I think in this case, a lighter weight DLSS model that potentially exists there on Switch, at least visually, that we can confirm with our eyes. We don't have any, I don't think we have any background information yet about its actual existence. It's just more like putting two and two together. And in that case, I don't really think there's a good point for it on PC, just because it could dilute a bit of the DLSS brand name at that point. Kind of like maybe Intel sees with XeSS, where everyone has a certain idea of what XeSS is, but they're basing upon the DP4A version, which is qualitatively and performance-wise inferior to the actual XMX version that runs only on Intel GPUs. So I don't think NVIDIA wants to do that just yet, but who knows? I mean, they're a company of mysteries. They do things where I sometimes go, why are you doing this? So who knows what the future may bring.
If and when they enter the mobile space in the PC world, that might cause a bit of a change of heart there.
That's true.
If they have an ultra low power GPU, just like the Switch 2, which they're deploying in the PC space or the handheld PC space, there may well be a reason to unleash a new model.
Yeah, that would be a good place. And I would also really love to see that at this point in time, because what we're seeing with Switch 2 for hardware, what you're getting there on the screen versus how much power is being used is really impressive given everything else about the system. I really think that's only Ampere we're looking at. What if we were looking at the latest TSMC process with much, high, like the higher spec stuff? Like, it would be really interesting to see how much that could shake up the mobile space on PC, even with ARM in there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any final comments there, Oliver?
No, I think that Switch 2 has been a pretty pleasant surprise so far in some respects. I mean, there are some games that I'm not as big of a fan of that I have sampled, games like Hitman in particular, which in portable mode is very oversharpened. It's very, very oversharpened. Right. Does not look too flattering there. I think there are some cases where you do see the kind of limits to the hardware, but then there are other games, well-optimized titles like Cyberpunk or Hogwarts, where it's like, this is doing a lot better of a job than I thought it would. So there's a bit of a divergence there between the kind of the upper tier titles and lower tier titles. But so far, I've been pretty happy with it.